Welcome to this quantum security and defense presentation, Contextualising Strategic Cybersecurity, the Global Perspective. And thank you for being a valued member of our community. Professor Julian Richards is a leading expert in intelligence, security, and counter-terrorism, with over 3 decades of experience across government and academia. Before joining the University of Buckingham as Director of the Centre for Security and Intelligence Studies, BUCSIS, he spent 18 years at the UK's Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ, where he held senior roles in intelligence analysis, training programme design, and strategic liaison. He is a recognised subject matter expert in global security, cybersecurity, intelligence operations, terrorism, counter-terrorism, and extremist ideologies. Professor Richards holds a PhD from the University of Cambridge and has dedicated his career to advancing understanding and education in national and international security.
Great pleasure to be talking to you this afternoon on a slightly rainy and autumnal UK afternoon. As described, I'm currently the director of an academic centre in the UK called the Centre for Security and Intelligence Studies at the University of Buckingham. We've been going here since about 2010 in earnest, and have built up a range of courses and a large cohort of students who are specifically interested in the academic study of intelligence, but also in the broader security contextualization of it. So we have academic programs at undergraduate, masters and PhD levels, but also some short courses aimed at professionals who are working in the business. And very much the focus of our centre is firstly to be very focused on contemporary issues. Secondly, to be very much focused on policy and strategy outcomes. So rather than just focusing on theory and academic theory, we do a bit of that, of course, but we want to answer the so what questions. And that feeds into our third objective, which is to help either existing professionals or already working in security roles in many different hues. A lot of our students are current practitioners, excuse me, and also to provide career pathways for young people who want to go into security and intelligence. Now, as Anna described, before coming here, I worked for many years at GCHQ in the UK, which an institution with which many of you are probably familiar. And as I've joked with Steve and Anna in the past, my role was politely called a generalist. So although GCHQ is at one level an intensely technical organisation that's dealing with cutting edge technology, whether it's in signals and communications or now cyber and cyber networks and so on. I was very much an analyst and I worked with technicians a lot. And over the years, almost by osmosis, I gained a degree of technical understanding and knowledge, never enough to actually be useful in a technical sense. I couldn't leap on a terminal and fix something or do any coding or anything. But I could talk to the technicians in a language that they understood and could interpret what they were saying, which was often somewhat impenetrable to senior policymakers and decision makers. And that in lots of ways, has kind of defined my career, is being that bridge between increasingly very technical issues and the need to understand them from a policy and management and strategic perspective. And of course, in the current world of galloping cybersecurity threats and developments, this is increasingly challenging for many managers of organizations. So that's kind of the theme of today, really, is to look at strategic cybersecurity in a global perspective and to introduce elements of which we're putting together into a little mini course. And I'll say a few more words about that at the end in terms of the components. But today's presentation is an overview of that course that introduces the first set of thoughts about the key issues that we're going to talk about on that course. I'll try and blast through this in 30 or 40 minutes or so, and hopefully invite some questions and discussion at the end. Of course, it's very, very difficult to compact a lot of this into 1 hour. So today is probably, hopefully, the beginning of many conversations that we'll be having. So pretty much all of us around the table will know the broad perspectives here. Cybersecurity threats are increasing in sophistication and intensity across all areas of society, and every single business, large or small, increasingly has to think about this now. I'm always slightly circumspect about figures that are put to the degree of cybercrime that's out there and the losses that organizations suffer, partly because it's very difficult to estimate those effectively. But the one common theme is that they're always very large numbers. So the figures that EM Broker produced recently, just one of many commentators on this, suggested that cybercrime cost businesses about $8 trillion in 23, and that's going upwards, and by 2027 that could be as much as $24 trillion. These are kind of crazy figures in a way, but they underline the fact that this is a huge issue and a huge management issue for all organizations. When we break down the risks and the threats, there are actually several different ones depending on which business you're in. Cybercrime is in some ways the most pervasive, especially theft of intellectual property and sensitive data or personal data that has a monetizable value when it's resold. But also industrial espionage is increasing in scale and sophistication. Ransomware for hire. So a lot of proxy operators popping up who are being used by hostile actors. And disruption of trade networks. And that's something that I'll come back to a bit later, because this isn't necessarily just about the particular organization that's hit, it's about the ramifications for global and international trade. In the political space, we're also hearing much talk of disinformation and electoral interference. And that again is an interesting debate, which I'll explore a little bit later on. There's no question that this is increasing, not just in size and scale, but also in the effectiveness and sophistication of it. And in many parts of the world, ironically, often outside of the Western world, this is proving to be a real issue. So if in Africa and Asia, for example, there's a lot of concern about rampant disinformation that accompanies electoral processes. In terms of global actors, it remains the case, as in many domains, that the US is still very dominant in terms of cyber and associated communications capability, which again I'll say a bit more about in a short while. But in this particular world, that doesn't necessarily mean you rule the roost, and asymmetric conflict tactics such as throwing large numbers of human beings at a problem rather than technology can level the playing field to a certain extent. And we're also seeing some very serious, what I call technology breakout issues, where highly effective tools that the US and particularly the NSA might be developing can end up falling into the wrong hands. And we'll talk a bit more about that as well. And we'll finish off our discussion today with a quick thought about regulation. And the bottom line is that there really isn't very much of it yet, for all sorts of reasons. And there's also disagreement about what that should look like if we do have regulation. So I'll say a few words about that. Now, I was looking at assessments of the scale and the pace and the nature of the threat recently, and I came across the assessment by CrowdStrike, a very well-known cybersecurity company, for this year. And this has got some fairly scary figures, as you can see. 150% increase in China nexus activity. China, I'm afraid, is a country we're going to mention a few times this afternoon in various different contexts. They're clearly developing very rapidly and aggressively developing their cyber capabilities in all sorts of areas. Massive growth in phishing operations. We've heard of phishing and spear phishing. Phishing, as many of you know, I'm sure, is a basic social engineering approach that involves somebody calling you up and tricking you into giving access to personal data. A massive increase in that in the recent year or two. The speed at which a hit can develop and break out is increasing and is now less than a minute, according to CrowdStrike on average, which means if you are hit or you're dealing with a cyber attack, you haven't got very long to deal with it. And an increasing number, in fact, the majority of attacks are no longer about traditional notions of malware per se, but are about other techniques and other approaches. The number of known and identifiable adversaries, whether those are advanced persistent threat organizations or other types of actors, is increasing. And a lot of it, more than half, according to CrowdStrike, is about that initial access to a network and a system, which in a way gives us some pointers as to where the cybersecurity strategy should be really focused. So these are quite interesting thoughts about not just the scale of it, but the nature of it and the way it might be changing over time. For many states, particularly more advanced states, but not just more advanced states, there's a bit of a conundrum here. A lot of our states really want to recognize and capitalize on the economic opportunities of high-tech industry, of cybersecurity and related industry. UK is no different from that. So there's kind of a balancing act between showing that you're a good place to invest in, that you have an effective high-tech sector that attracts serious amounts of investment, but at the same time showing that you're a safe place to operate in from a cybersecurity point of view, and that you're a place where if companies are locating with very sensitive technology, that they're not going to be easily ripped off or attacked in your particular sector. And this, for governments, this is quite a complicated high wire act to navigate. And in the policy, it's quite interesting that you'll see a mixture of positive forward-leaning narratives and strategy and defensive narratives and strategy, which don't always go very well together. And if you're interested in this, particularly in the context of political interference or potential political interference, I published a paper about this in a Spanish journal a few years ago about fake news and disinformation that you might want to check out, that particularly related to a set of referenda and votes about 10 years ago in the UK context. So if we think about it from a state point of view, which sort of states are we talking about? Well, the major technical and intelligence superpowers, of which, as we've said already, the US is still very dominant. We know that they can and they will use massive scale capabilities and webs of relationships with technologically advanced partners to facilitate and conduct cyber activities for intelligence advantage. That's nominally the core objective of having this capability and using it. Cyber capabilities are now increasingly interlaced with other intelligence capabilities, and particularly with signals intelligence and communications technologies, which is why the cyber capabilities in countries such as the US and the UK sit very much in what were the SIGINT organizations, such as NSA and GCHQ. The US ostensibly operates a principle which is sometimes described as the Nobus principle, which means nobody but us, and particularly in areas such as encryption and decryption. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, but it's basically a mechanism for staying out ahead of all the key adversaries. And that will determine how those adversaries are developing, will determine what happens on that front. While the US is enormously dominant in reach and capability, this doesn't mean it's, as we've said earlier, that other states with different or lesser capabilities can't achieve effect. And in some ways, that's one of the opportunities, if we can call it that, of cyber capability. Things can be achieved for a much lower cost and lower technical capability if you do the right things. In some cases, throwing manpower at it can be effective in conjunction with growing technical capability. And that's certainly how China appears to be approaching the situation, a degree of industrializing of its capability in both scale and reach. Particularly active states in the hacking world, if we can describe it as that, aside from the US, which we'll say a bit more about, they're headed by the US's Five Eyes partners, its traditional signals intelligence partners, UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. But other interesting states include France, particularly in the economic espionage realm, Israel, Iran, China, India, Russia, and North Korea. And in the crime space, there are of course, many actors, but it's unfortunately the case that Nigerian crime gangs, which have always been active in certain types of crimes, and particularly fraud-related crimes, are still very prevalent in such areas as social engineering attacks for commercial gain. And a lot of those groups are adapting quite well from traditional methods of carrying out those frauds into more cyber and social media enabled methods. And many of the state-sponsored activities are characterized by the West as specific advanced persistent threat actors, or APTs. So those are the groups that are more clearly linked to specific states and in many cases to specific departments within states. But they're seen, one of the developments, as we've described already, is that this picture may be diversifying and pluralizing in quite complex ways.
You can join the CUSEC-DEF community to watch the full version of this and over 80 other lectures on quantum technologies, attend events, receive free training, and more. CUSEC-DEF is a users community working to forward quantum secure communications. The community is represented by Quantum Security and Defense that provides supply chain orchestration and consulting services on behalf of our members. Find out more. Google quantumsecuritydefense.com today.